And so this is now what the debate is about. Is that free will?
No.
Gregg says no,
But
I say yes.
listen,
and so, but the point is
every-
that in principle, if you've concluded determinism is true, the debate's not over,
No,
right?
of course not. But Jeremy, everything.
But I'm just saying that
everything
this
you
is the move
said
I'm seeing made.
is consistent with the kind of free will skepticism
Absolutely,
that I defend.
absolutely.
Where you're not,
I just want to set the terms of the
But-
debate.
If you take the idea that we have no choice, that we have no moral agency to its end, we're coming out of a 2-year genocide that's continuing. And I've been following the trials of the IDF soldiers that were guilty of rape on camera, and they're pleading the defense that many criminals plead, which is I was just following orders. It was under compulsion. I had no choice of my own. And I think that once you strip us of our ultimate objective of existence, then you strip us of everything that is secondary to that as well. And you remove then any agency from the human being, and that's a worldview, that's a ditch that I don't think we can climb out of as human beings. I think that it strips us of our agency. I think that it also strips us of our potential, because what we've seen in the people of Gaza, you just gave one example of your ability to overcome a difficult period in your life by looking at the circumstances that were given to you and responding in a certain way. What we've seen in the people of Gaza is that they have been able to hold two truths at the same time together, that my suffering is not without meaning and that my suffering is entirely unjustifiable, that those who perpetrated the crime are unjustified in doing so, but that there is a redemption and there is a meaning and there is a purpose that I can find even in the most difficult circumstances that I have been in.
Gregg Caruso does Benjamin Netanyahu have no free will?
I don't think anyone has free will, so it doesn't matter who.
Vladimir Putin.
But I want to just clarify, we don't lack agency, and we don't lack a certain type of control, and we do make choices. There are different ways to justify reactions to wrongdoing. One sense of reaction is retributive. They deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done. That's the kind of view that I think requires free will, or at least the kind of free will I reject. There are other forward-looking reasons to engage in punishment or sanctions or interventions. We intervene when my daughter does something wrong. I introduce a consequence, but that's for the forward-looking moral formation of her as an individual. I want to shape her as an individual, and I'm introducing a cause now to help her future decisions, to calculate them in a certain kind of way. We punish other people, like maybe Netanyahu or someone else, for deterrence, right? We want to deter other would-be criminals. We also just, on my view, have to isolate certain people who pose a risk to society. And that would be totally consistent in any of these geopolitical contexts to justify sanctions on these individuals. But you do not need to presuppose the kind of free will I'm denying to justify that.
Could I jump in here quickly? So one of the things that, and I see this move a lot in the free will debate, is that people conclude that determinism is true, or they think that science shows that determinism is true, and then they equate that with the conclusion that there's no free will. And I think that regardless of what side of the debate you come down on, you have to make a distinction between determinism is true, like we're purely factors of our environment and biology, whatever. You have to distinguish between determinism is true and free will is false, because determinism and free will, they're just different theses altogether. You can't equate them. So let's suppose determinism is true. Let's suppose that we are all products of our environment and our genetics and everything else. Well, let me tell you a just so story, right? Let's suppose that determinism is true. Well, we still have to control people's behavior somehow. We can't let people just do whatever they want. And so we still have to introduce a set of sanctions. We still have to hold people accountable for what they do. And these sanctions that we impose on people are intended to be determinants to incentivize them to do this and not to do that. And in imposing this system of sanctions, we have to distinguish between things that are under people's control and things that are not under people's control. Again, we can punish you for telling a lie. We can't punish you for not jumping over a building, right? Because one is in your control and one is not under your control. And so even if you think determinism is true, you're still going to hold people accountable. You're still going to distinguish between things that are under that person's control and things that are not under that person's control. And so this is now what the debate is about. Is that free will?
No.
Gregg says no,
But-
I say yes.
but listen,
But the point is that in principle, determinism is not, if you've concluded determinism is true, the debate's not over,
No,
right?
of course not. But Jeremy, everything,
But I'm just saying that
everything
this
you
is the move I'm
said
seeing made.
is consistent with the kind of free will skepticism
Absolutely,
that I defend.
absolutely. I just want to set the terms of the
But
debate
where
here.
you're not going is saying you're giving forward-looking justifications for those sanctions. And that forward-looking justification is completely open to people who reject free will. What you need to defend, if you're going to defend a stronger thesis or a thesis worth defending, is that there's some sort of fundamental desert that the agents are subject to. If you're going to give just purely forward-looking justifications for intervening, introducing new causes, that's totally consistent with the rejection of free will, or the kind of free will as I define it.
Bayan, you want to come in?
So I agree with Professor Koons. I think that we do have free will, and I think perpetrators should be held accountable to their actions. Taking into account what had happened in Gaza, the genocide, we can't say that Benjamin Netanyahu did not have the free will to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, violated international law, conscious, made decision, and he knows that he's a war criminal. He was labeled by international law that he was a war criminal, and received a lot of backlash for his actions. So in that sense, we could say that he was pretty much conscious, that he was killing a nation, massacring and genociding Gazans in Gaza. So I think this kind of interferes with the concept that he did not have the free will. I think he did, and he should be punished for his actions, as there were victims in that case.
Let's break
Yeah.
it all down.
Yeah,
Let's
so-
say a world without free will, now redesign it for us and convince them then, because I see this beating heart of justice,
Yeah.
that's pushing back here. Convince the students, the audience, that it will be a just world.
There's a dark side to the belief in free will. People tend to always look at the other aspects, the ones that are being highlighted here in this conversation. But there's empirical work that's been done that shows belief in free will correlates with increased punitiveness. So we punish people more harshly, and in a place like the United States, where we have mass incarceration and we have a very retributive criminal justice system, it's being driven primarily by this notion of retribution, which is grounded in this belief in free will. There's evidence that shows belief in free will is connected with acceptance of economic inequality. And it's tied to this belief in just desserts. If you end up in poverty, if you end up in prison, if you end up in some sort of suppressed or stratified social structure,
It's your fault.
It's your fault. And there's a lot of evidence that the belief in free will correlates with something called just world belief, that the world is just and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It sounds innocuous. It sounds like it isn't that dangerous a belief, but it actually manifests itself in a blame the victim approach. 89% of women imprisoned in the United States were previously victims of abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, some other type of child abuse. You could say they deserve it. And yes, they must have done something wrong to get found guilty and put in prison. But you could also say, I see a causal connection here between the previous victimization and the circumstances in which they now find themselves. And if you begin to view humanity in that way, on my approach, you could adopt a more forward-looking, preventative approach, grounded in social justice, and one that aims at rehabilitation and reintegration, instead of just punishing people and hoping they become better. Because prisons are dehumanizing, we treat them like animals, we instill learned helplessness, and then we release them and say, now be model citizens. We've done nothing to better them. We provided them with no education. And I really do believe these beliefs in free will are important precisely because they drive these policies. If everyone is just morally responsible, for their actions, then the appropriate response to criminal behavior is punitive.
Okay, so we're going to get Sheikh. What's interesting is that you probably agree with a lot of what he's saying.
I'd like
For
to say,
slightly
like,
different
you will
reasons.
never find me, someone who fights mass incarceration,
Yes.
goes to ICE facilities every week, in any way an apologist.
No, and I think
for
we
that-
have a
for
lot
that-
of
for that
overlap.
viciousness. What I would say, though, is what you attribute the grossness of the American justice system, criminal justice system, and everything that happens under its purview is not to something that's been determined outside of anyone's action, but instead you trace down who the nefarious actors actually are, and you start to peel that back, and you start to channel action towards what drives that system. So I absolutely agree that you don't, simply blame the person who is a product of this criminal justice system, which has in its cycle, processes that will render the same result in 89% or 95% of the situations.
Maria, come in.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I would like to say that I do not think that free will is incompatible with the idea of the empathetic legal system. Because I think that, yes, of course, we are brought up in certain circumstances that influence our decisions. But at the same time, I do think that there is a scope in which we do have free will, in which we do have a choice. And that means that if we are to only look at the person's circumstances when we are making a decision about their crime, for example, it would mean that we completely ignore the fact that even though they were brought up in a certain system, they had a choice of committing the crime or not committing the crime. As, for example, we've been mentioning people in Gaza. They had the choice of resisting or of not resisting. They chose to resist. So I feel like we all have a choice in the circumstances that we are in.
We don't want to say, well, we need a moral universe, we need moral blameworthiness, and therefore free will must be the case, or we need to believe in the illusion of free will. Much better would be to prove that there's free will in fact, and as a consequence of that, morality would emerge. Now, concerning this one study you just mentioned about being able to predict, well, it may be true that, in an MRI study, I'm able to predict whether people will choose left versus right with, say, 60% accuracy when chance is 50% 10 seconds before. But I can predict, that 10 years from now, in the year, whatever it's going to be, 2035, that on this day or date at 3:14 a.m., you will, with a 90% probability, be asleep. And that's probably almost surely true. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have no volition at all, right? You're able to deliberate, consider your, what you want to pay attention to in light of your own reasons.
Greg, can we have purpose in life if we don't have free will?
Yes. So I think that even if we lack free will, we can preserve most of what we want in terms of our interpersonal relationships, meaning in life, morality, creativity, and even what is necessary to maintain social order. So in my work, again, I've kind of systematically gone through these different domains to try to say, there are these alternatives to some of our current practices that would do all the same work that our existing practices do, perhaps without the negative aspects, like the corrosive nature of moral anger, for example, often gets in the way of our interpersonal relationships and actually is probably more harmful for the goals we're looking to achieve, like moral formation in my daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to make her a better person.
So I need you to walk me through that
Yes.
because I have 2-year-old twins and I'm often trying to change and shape them morally.
Yeah.
What's the best way to go about that? What do you mean by moral formation?
So here is a kind of forward-looking set of practices we could adopt even if we lack free will.
Mm-hmm.
Someone does something, could be my daughter. I ask her, why did you, what were the reasons for why you acted in that way? She could then identify those reasons for her action. You could ask her to reflect upon those reasons, say, what do those reasons reveal about you as a person? Do you think that there are any measures you can take moving forward that would alter those kinds of characteristics that you find undesirable? And the moral exchange, and I've cashed this out sort of in a number of my works, the moral exchange would be grounded in a set of practices where it's not based on desert, It's based on moral formation. So as a parent, I have a vested interest in the moral development of my child.
Right.
As a member of society, I also have a vested interest in maintaining safety. So when wrongdoers engage in wrongdoing, you want to be able to engage in acts of what I call moral protest, which are still, I think, justifiable. It's just not associated with the kind of angry blame, if you want to use a term, that is often associated with the belief in free will. And I actually think freeing it from angry blame is an actually better way to achieve these forward-looking goals. Reconciliation is also a big one.
I think, look, our brains are an algorithm. And, when we're talking about control, and you had asked this question earlier about your children and teaching them morality, and, I have children as well. I think what we can control is the input to our algorithm. And even with unconscious biases, right? These studies show like people are more likely to think, a Black person is going to commit a crime because maybe that's what they're seeing. And the input is always seeing that person of that color skin committing crimes. And then the brain uses heuristics because it's too complex to have to take each individual case. But if you change the input, the algorithm changes, and therefore you can change unconscious biases. So I think that Peter's on something with the choices that we can make about what we decide to enter into the system, or what we allow our kids to consume, which is going to impact their brain's algorithm and those unconscious desires and things. The question of AI. So I mean, my fear with AI, and I just came from a meeting where people were giving these talks about AI that was very scary, to be honest. I mean, they can cheat. They can now like lie and manipulate and for their own survival. And when they start to get sort of agency and they do things other than what we program them to do, and then they have access to all this information that we can possibly get in our whole lifetime, there's a threat there. But I don't think that they'll ever be conscious in their current form, which is another debate we can have, because they're just simulations, and if you simulate the weather, it's not going to actually be wet. If you simulate a black hole, you won't get sucked into your computer. So I don't think they can be conscious. And I think you need consciousness to have this illusion of free will or perception of free will. So without consciousness, they will not have free will, but they could very well have agency, which is deciding to do something other than what it was programmed to do.
The scariest thing about what you said, Heather, is in their current form. So it sounds like you're saying there could be a form.
It depends on the theory of consciousness you go by, but is it substrate independent? Could consciousness exist in something other than a biological brain? And if you believe yes, then it's sort of a functionalist. You think it's just, if I can build a neuron, a silicon chip that can do the same thing as a neuron, and then, so if you built like a neuromorphic computer, if you have, depending on your theory of consciousness, theoretically, it could be conscious. It could be a conscious machine, but then it would have to be something that can change and evolve, because we're not static. Our brain is always changing and evolving to the environment. So it would have to be some sort of matter you can build it in that can change. So it'd be very complex. But ultimately, if we can build something similar to the brain in a non-biological substance, theoretically, it could be conscious.
Well, this is where I think religion becomes very helpful for kind of ordering our priorities, because if you believe that God is the only ultimate creator and that he's the only one who is able to ensoul beings, give them a soul and give them, in effect, consciousness, then you can kind of rest assured that AI will never be able to get to that level, for the simple reason that man is not capable of doing what only God is capable of. So religion, even regardless of whether certain religious ideas are true or not, they help us order our universe and understand things that are otherwise very complicated. So if you're a religious person, you can mostly do away with this whole debate about free will, because at least in the Abrahamic traditions, God already gives you some sense of what you should believe. You follow that view of free will and agency, and you move on and do the next thing in your life, and you don't have to like freak out about what the science says.
And the free will was assigning yourself to that religion in the first place, or choosing to have that faith in the first place.
Can I say something about religion? That we debated religious leaders at one time in Parliament. They in the UK, they brought together neuroscientists with like the heads of these major religions, and we had this debate about, if we discovered the neural basis of consciousness, what would that mean for the concept of a soul? And the consensus was, at least from the religious side, which I think is true, is that it's independent of what the science finds, right? That this soul, this concept of, or maybe there's just a consciousness out there, maybe you call that God or however you conceptualize it, will exist independent of whether we find a neural basis of consciousness or not. The soul is a separate thing. And that kind of gives me that, as when I take my scientist hat off, gives me some comfort to say, yeah, maybe there is something special about this humanness and this feeling that I feel in this consciousness. But I recognize that as being a belief that doesn't necessarily have any proof, as a scientist.
I'm talking to scientists here, so you'll have to forgive me.
I'm a philosopher.
Okay, I'm a philosopher too. What is this obsession with proof?
Because I think I could believe, there's this classic idea, like maybe there's how many religions in the world, right? So it's like, you might believe in one, I believe in another. How do I know what is the right even religion, let's say?
Well, that's why it's faith.